And that's okay. All right. So for everyone who's in the room and for those of us who are joining online, this session is all about medical devices. So medical devices generating and using real-world observational data for decision-making on value. It's my honor to be the moderator for this morning's session. I'm Tammy Clifford. I'm CADIS Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence Standards, and in my spare time, I'm also currently CADIS Vice President of its Medical Device and Rapid Response programs, thus my keen interest in medical devices and in real-world evidence. Just for folks to understand what we're going to be doing this morning for the session, we're together for 75 minutes. We have 4 panelists who will each come up here individually to provide their presentations. We've asked them to aim for about 12 minutes per presentation. That'll allow us some time for questions directed at each individual presenter. For those joining us via webinar, please feel free to submit your questions online, and those will be directed to me. At the end of all 4 presentations, the panelists will join me here up at the front for the hope of having a nice interactive conversation for whatever time is remaining. If I could just ask people to ensure that your cell phones are on vibrate or silent, just as a courtesy to all of those in the audience. And perhaps with that, I will welcome up to the front our very first speaker, Jessica Jalbert. I won't get into bios because you have those in the conference program or in the app, and I want to make sure our speakers have as much time as possible. So please, Jessica, welcome.
Great, thank you very much. So I will talk about considerations for comparative observational studies of implantable medical devices. I could talk about this at great length, but we don't have that time today, so I've decided to focus on 2 particularly salient parts to evaluate studies of medical devices or conduct them. So the first is going to be device characteristics, and the second is going to be provider level effects. So device characteristics. So all these devices, so these are pictures of stents, right? So conceptually they're all stents, but they're all clearly different. So we have stents of different diameters. You have stents with different strut designs. You have in the bottom you have a stent that's squiggly shaped, and then you also have tapered stents. So clearly you can imagine that these stents are going to be used for different indications, and also that they might have different safety and effectiveness profiles. So medical device life cycles. So life cycles of medical devices tend to be much shorter than for drugs. So one of the reasons for that is that it's a very different regulatory landscape. So any change in the chemical structure of a drug or in the dose or in the mode of administration will require a new regulatory submission. But that's not necessarily the case for medical devices. So as a result, you have devices that tend to be tweaks of previous versions of themselves. So you have iterative improvements of existing technologies. You have incremental changes to devices and procedures are therefore common, either with the intent to improve the performance of the device or to overcome their shortcomings. And so what this means is that there might be devices or versions of devices that are on the market for a very short period of time before they're being discontinued or replaced by more innovative versions of themselves. We also have issues with medical device systems. So devices can be either marketed as individual separate components or as systems. So here I have an example of a system, which is a hip arthroplasty replacement device. So this system consists of a femoral stem, a femoral head, a liner, and an acetabular component. So this is marketed as a system. But once the patient is on the table, it doesn't necessarily mean that the physician will implant that one system of a device. physicians can sometimes mix and match different systems together. And so as you can imagine, you might end up with different combinations that have very different safety and effectiveness profiles. So now let's talk a little bit about how we identify these implantable medical devices in data sources that are widely used to evaluate their performance in the real world. So you have administrative claims data, which are widely used for research. They're relatively inexpensive, and they generally represent large populations. But in terms of medical device, one of the main disadvantages is that there's not a specific field generally in claims data for medical devices. You have to identify the implantation through the procedure code for the implantation of that device. So that means that you're looking at IC9, IC10 codes, or CPT4 codes to identify the device. That means that there isn't necessarily device-specific information. Actually, a lot of times there's little or no information available on that device. When there is, it tends to be high level. So if we go back to the first slide where I showed all the different types of stent, you might know that that stent that was inserted is a drug-eluting stent or a bare metal stent, but you're seriously not going to get at any of the, is it squiggly shaped or tapered, or what is the diameter of that device, or that stent. Electronic healthcare records can also be used to evaluate the performance of implantable medical devices. A lot of the information that's available in electronic healthcare records is also available in claims data, so that means that you could also identify devices that are implanted through their procedure codes. Additional information might be available either about the device or the procedure, but that's in the electronic healthcare record. So that might be available in the surgical notes. So if you want to get at that information, you may need to essentially text mine the data, or essentially, depending on the electronic healthcare record system, there might be some capture of that information in a special field. But one of the issues with electronic healthcare records, particularly in the U.S., is there's a lack of standardization, certainly across institutions, but we've noticed even within institutions, different billing records, the systems essentially collect the information differently. And then, of course, if you're interested in looking at long-term follow-up, a patient who gets a device in a hospital or in a clinic and then essentially receives the rest of their care elsewhere, you're going to be missing, you're going to be not capturing their outcome data. And device registries, in terms of device identification, are great. It's essentially their raison d'être is to study the real-world performance of these devices, so we can rely on them to have detailed information about the procedure and about the device. But they tend to have smaller populations. They also tend to and may be selected, and then they also might have an issue of follow-up. So to wrap up this portion about the device characteristics, so what are the implications of what it is that we've been discussing if you want to study the real-world effectiveness and safety of a device, or if you want to evaluate a study which does? So clearly there could be multiple versions of a device in a population. There could be multiple combinations of components of different systems within a population. Each of those device versions, each of those combinations can have different safety effectiveness profiles. If we can't get at the information, the detailed information about the device, we have to assume that there is a uniform safety and effectiveness profile, and that may clearly not be the case. So if the information is available, ideally we'd want to stratify by device, whether it's all the information that we have, so manufacturer, version, lot, etc. Or, of course, if we want to look at different combinations. But unfortunately, we might have too few patients or too little data to basically study all those permutations. So now moving on to provider-level characteristics. So the role of the provider is something that's going to be pretty important in the performance, or maybe pretty important in the performance of an implantable medical device. So the operator's skill and learning curve is going to be, how important those factors are is going to be related to the procedural complexity. So the more complex or the more difficult it is to implant that medical device, the more important operator skill and the learning curve are going to be. So clearly the provider skill and learning curve can affect patient outcomes, both in the short terms in terms of peri-procedural complications, and also in the long term in terms of revisions. And of course, if there's two interchangeable devices or procedures, the physician's familiarity for a given device or a procedure with a device could affect the choice of treatment. And then because the device needs to be implanted, is it implanted usually in a clinic or in an outpatient setting, whether or not that procedure or device is offered could clearly affect the choice of treatment, and then could affect also patient outcomes in terms of generally the quality of post-procedural care they offer. So this is a study where we looked at 30-day mortality risk and the past year physician carotid artery stenting volume. So carotid artery stenting is a percutaneous procedure where a stent is inserted into your carotid artery. And so it's a pretty complex procedure. And so what we see here, so we have mortality risk, and then at the bottom, on the x-axis, we have carotid artery stenting volume. So that's the volume of procedures that the physician has done in the past year. And what we found was that patients who were being seen by physicians who had done less procedures in the past year had a higher risk of mortality, right? And so you see it's a pretty nice linear line. And then right in the middle, you have the adjusted relative risk. And what we see is that even after we adjusted for patient and other provider level factors, that essentially physician volume and that association with mortality persisted. So we have in this figure, so this is looking at hospital carotid artery stenting volume. So the previous slide was on physician volume. This is on hospital volume. So again, we're looking at the past year volume. We're looking at volume categories. So we see that again, patients who are getting their procedures done in hospitals with less volume have higher risk of mortality. And then again, that this association persists after adjustment for patient and provider level factors. So in this slide, this is a study where we compared the effectiveness of carotid artery stenting to carotid endarterectomy. So carotid endarterectomy, so carotid artery stenting is a percutaneous procedure where they insert a stent in your carotid artery. Carotid endarterectomy is an open surgical procedure. So we looked at a number of outcomes, but if you focus on the first few, on mortality and the first few effect estimates, what we see is that the dot that's in red. So here we're comparing carotid artery stenting to endarterectomy for mortality. This estimate is highly confounded. Patients who are receiving carotid artery stenting, the indication for that is that they're at high surgical risk. So they're already coming with comorbidity burden, and they're already pretty sick. And so that estimate is highly confounded. When we adjusted for patient level factors, so the green dot, what we see is that it moved much closer. So the effect estimates moved much closer to null. So the line in the middle is the hazard ratio is equal to 1. So there's no difference between carotid artery stenting and carotid endarterectomy, which is what we're expecting to find, or what was seen in the trials. And so when we had very, very rich data, we linked registries with claims data, so a very rich data set. And we see that essentially, if we were only to adjust for patient level factors, we would conclude that patients undergoing carotid artery stenting were at higher risk of mortality than patients who were undergoing carotid endarterectomy. But once we adjusted for provider level factors, on top of adjusting for patient level factors, we see a further shift in the effect estimate. And in terms of what it is that we adjusted for, so it's the past year volume that we looked at in the previous slides, as well as things like, is it a teaching hospital where they're getting the procedure done? What is the hospital size? And is it a stroke center? So a number of different characteristics for the providers. And then if you just briefly look at the other effect estimates, what we see is that, again, if you're looking at the blue, at the green dots or the green shapes versus the blue shapes, additional adjustment for provider level factors in addition to patient level factors would continually shift the estimate. So I'm running out of time, so let me just conclude with, what are the implications of what it is that we've been discussing in terms of provider level factors. So real-world performance of implantable medical devices may be affected by operator and hospital proficiency. And this proficiency, and this is what I skipped over in the last two slides, but it can be very, very diverse in real-world settings. So within, even for carotid artery stenting, you can have a pretty big spectrum of skills and in the skills of providers able to implant that carotid artery stent. But also you can have quite a difference between two different procedures, right? So the proficiency can be different if you're comparing one procedure or one device versus another. So we really need to understand the role of the provider, ideally understand this volume outcome relationship, which we know may be related to outcomes, potentially adjust for provider proficiency. And although I've focused only on, or primarily on past year volume as a measure of provider experience and proficiency, there are clearly other provider characteristics that we might want to take into account. So I'd like to just thank my collaborators and mentors who are listed on this slide, and thank you for your attention.
Great. So I do have a question that's come in, and it asks Jessica about unique device identifiers. So at last year's CATA Symposium, we had a presentation speaking about sort of the present day movement towards unique device identifiers, and one of the audience members wanted to know if you see UDIs potentially changing our approach to this, particularly when you were mentioning the stent. You don't know if it's the curly one or the squiggly one or the tapered one. What will UDIs bring for this type of assessment?
Right, thank you. That's actually a really, really good question. So I think UDIs have great potential for research in this field, and definitely in helping us basically identify those different, specifically those different versions of devices and also those different components of devices. But of course, it depends on how it's going to be implemented. So for instance, if you think of the device system, right, the example of the hip arthroplasty that I gave. So I'm not 100% sure if the UDI will basically be on each one of those different components of the device, because if it's not, and then you're worried about basically this mixing of different components, then that's not going to be, you're not going to be able to study that even with the UDI. And then in terms of how it's being captured, I'm thinking in claims data, is it going to be just one field, right? So again, if you're thinking about the hip arthroplasty system, even if you do have different devices, the different UDIs for the different components of the device, if there's only one that's captured in the administrative claims data, then essentially you're not going to be able to study that either, right? But I mean, clearly I mean, in terms of the potential of UDIs, it's huge. So I mean, we're waiting for it to be able to use it in research. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And to those, again, participating via webinar, please keep your questions coming. They're making their way to me up here at the front. So our next speaker is Laura Hatfield from Harvard Medical School, and I'll bring her presentation up now. Laura's going to be talking to us about incorporating decision-maker loss functions in safety monitoring. So, of course, very pertinent to our medical devices work.
Thanks, Tammy, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me up here. I'm very aware that I'm meant to pay attention to hockey, and I understand that Boston has just lost, so you're all welcome to rub that in my face after the session. So, first, I want to give a little bit of a commercial for the people that I work with and whom I'm representing in today's talk. These are my co-authors on the manuscript that represents the work that I'm talking about today, including my senior colleague, Sharon Lees Norman, and some of the folks who weighed in as actual real-world non-ivory tower types. So very grateful to the people who met with me and explained that the world is not as tidy as I would like to believe it is in my models. And particularly to the MD EpiNet. So this is kind of a cool new-ish initiative of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's post-market device division. So they've made a public-private partnership, which is meant to bring together stakeholders from academia and from the medical device industry and also from the regulatory agency, the FDA, to talk about issues related specifically to medical devices out in the real world, that is in the post-market setting where we are implanting them and watching their performance and trying to read the tea leaves of medical billing claims and figure out what's going on. So MD EpiNet has 3 major centers in the U.S., of which I am a part of the Methodology Center. Full disclosure, I'm a statistician, but I did put all the Greek letters in my talk at the end. So here's the Methodology Center, and this is work that was sponsored by this MD EpiNet grant. So thanks for the support. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about this concept of safety signal escalation, what my mental model is for how real-world evidence gets translated into action by regulators. I'll talk a little bit about a kind of a toy example, frankly, because Jessica's talk was a brilliant introduction to the difficulties of measuring in administrative data sources what was actually done in the cardiac cath suite or wherever you're interested in, and then what the patient outcomes were. So Thank you for that background. I'm going to ask you to assume all of that away for purposes of my talk. Pretend you can observe a safety signal of interest. And then I will introduce some Bayesian hierarchical models that I'm fitting to those data. And my main thesis, if you leave my talk with nothing else, it's the idea that economists for a long time have written down loss function-driven models for how people behave. They assume that we are rational actors who inside our head have a linear function of costs and benefits that we take the derivative of and maximize, right? That's how you all make decisions. I know it's how I make decisions. I'm going to take that and marry that idea for how people make decisions with a statistical framework that is meant to integrate evidence across diverse sources and put those two ideas together and say if we can marry statistical evidence with loss functions that describe all of our priorities, then we could make better decisions. There are a lot of big ifs in that sentence, but go with me on the journey today, I hope. And so that's my decision framework. So signals escalation essentially turns data or evidence into actions. You collect some safety data either through passive or active surveillance. You set some performance targets for how you hope that the actors in your system will behave on these measures that you're collecting. Could be things like model-based estimates as in my framework, or you could have objective performance goals. Then you compare the data that come in to those targets that you set, and you measure some distance between those. Are you performing at expectations, below expectations, above expectations? There are many ways you could measure that. And then given that you are performing out of range, that is, suppose in the safety setting that your safety performance is below expectations, what do? You have to take some sort of action on that evidence. I see, when I look at this system, several potential methodological gaps that a statistician like me could address. So for one, the data collection is tricky. I think we heard a lot about that from Jessica. The setting of performance targets is also tricky. There's a lot of pushback from stakeholders on the use of historical information to set current safety targets. People want to not be evaluated on their past performance. They want today's data to stand on its own. The comparison of data to targets is typically done using very unsophisticated statistical signals. I think I wrote the word z-scores up there. That really is the state of the art right now. And then the translation of those z-scores, you know, if they're out of range, into actions is kind of a binary decision. Do we do something or not? And very, very often, the decision is more complicated than that. It's not take action or not. It's what sort of action do we have to take? So simply declaring something statistically significant is not helpful enough. We can do better than that. These bolded items are the ones that I'm hoping to address today. I'm not going to talk about the data collection. I'm not in that space right now. And I'm also going to leave aside the fact that in the real world, decisions come in a sequential fashion. You make one decision, maybe you collect more data, you reevaluate the data, you make another decision. I'm going to take a point-in-time decision. So now you know the scope of what I've set out for myself today. In my decision-making framework, translating data into actions, I train models, hierarchical Bayesian models, on historical data in order to set the targets for performance. I construct a posterior predicted distribution for the expected performance, and then I can create a posterior distribution on the safety signal itself, that is the discrepancy between observed performance and the target. And then I can take action using something called Bayesian minimum risk decision. I'm going to compare that along the way to sort of my dumb straw man, which is computing z-scores and then ordering those z-scores and taking decisions based on that. So as you know, the z-scores are going to lose because I've already told you they're my straw man. Here's my little toy data example. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality in the United States collects healthcare information across hospital settings. So these are inpatient discharge summaries. I'm taking the national inpatient sample and limiting to the observations from 4,600 hospitals all across the United States, which have at least 100 pediatric discharges in a year. So I'm interested only in children's admissions. And I'm limiting to hospitals that have contributed data to this for at least 3 years. And my safety signal, which again, I will admit this is kind of a toy signal, but imagine your favorite safety signal here instead. Mine is going to be the rate of discharges that have some sort of a problem with a medical device. There's a list of codes someone published. We just took that list and applied it to these data and said there's some ratio at each hospital of the number of discharges that have a problem with any sort of medical device out of all pediatric discharges. So this is a hospital level device-ish safety indicator, but imagine your favorite safety indicator here. And then essentially we look at the historical performance of each hospital over time, we set a safety target, and then we compare the observed to the expected performance. And then, in order to make the problem a little bit harder, we have a set of actions that we might take if the signal is out of range. That is, if the safety performance is worse than expected, we imagine a hierarchy of actions which starts at the lowest level of the hierarchy by doing nothing. We could investigate, which is an action that essentially sends data collectors out to the hospital to figure out what's going on. There's a more intense level of investigation, which is an audit. There's a remediation, which is actually meant to lower the risk of this safety signal. And then finally, the most extreme action is a shutdown. This actually did happen in Massachusetts. It was part of the motivation for this project. A major cardiac center was shut down temporarily because their safety performance was so far out of range that they actually shut down the cardiac unit at that hospital. Hopefully this happens rarely in our data. So if you imagine two hospitals, hospital A and B, we've seen that their rate of this adverse medical device event, this number that's between 0 and 1 for the rate of pediatric admissions that involve any problem with the medical device, has been going along over time, and at hospital A it has historically been higher than at hospital B. When we interrogate what's different about those two hospitals and why we might want to treat them differently, we notice that hospital A is a big public urban teaching hospital with 97% pediatric admissions, whereas hospital B is a small private urban non-teaching hospital with only 5% pediatric admissions. So if you had to guess what the name of hospital A was, it would be something with the word children's in it, right? Whereas hospital B could be, community hospital X. So obviously we should hold these two hospitals to a different standard, and that's why their performance is different. Presumably hospital A is treating much sicker children. So we want to account for all of that in our models, of course, and also in our loss function. So this is the innovation. Most of the time we would case mix adjust the safety signal, right? So just as Jessica discussed, when you adjust for patient and provider characteristics, you get a very different answer. So we're going to do all of that. We're going to adjust for everything that we can measure about the patient case mix at each hospital. We're also going to adjust for the hospital characteristics. And then in our decision-making process, we're also going to account for differences between the two hospitals. So for example, a critical access hospital that is the only hospital in an area that serves patients in a very isolated area, we would want to treat them differently because something like a shutdown or even an audit, which could absorb a lot of that hospital's resources, should be taken with different frequency than at a hospital that has a lot of competitors in its local market, has a lot of extra resources to devote to something like a remediation effort. So we're going to build those considerations that are hospital-specific into the loss functions. I don't have time today, unfortunately, to go into my loss functions, but I just want to describe that each action has its own function that describes all of the costs and benefits of taking that action in ways that depend on the hospital for which you are considering that action and the strength of the safety signal that you observe. These are very simple-minded functions that a statistician, that's me, wrote down. What I wanted was for stakeholders to inform these functions, and that's the vision for this work, is that you would sit down with a stakeholder and say, how much would it cost you, hospital administrator, if I sent a team of safety auditors in? How much of your nursing resources could you devote to that? You, regulator, how much does it cost you in dollars? I'm doing air quotes, webinar people, in dollars if a patient is harmed. That's not actually a dollar cost, but you can attach a dollar value that puts everything on the same scale. So then, having written down those loss functions, we can translate those observed safety signals into action using this Bayesian framework, which is to integrate the loss function with respect to everything that we know about the strength of the safety signal. This is well-established statistical theory and machinery that has great theoretical properties, which I'm borrowing from the space of statistical decision-making, which is usually accept or reject a hypothesis, and translating it into real-world decision-making, where the action is investigate, remediate, audit, shut down. We compare that to just putting the z-scores in order from smallest to largest and cutting them up into chunks so that the biggest z-scores indicate a shutdown and the next biggest chunk indicate the next least severe action and on down the line. So this only works if we can put our actions in order of increasing severity, like I have set it up today. So when we do that, this is a comparison of the model predicted posterior expected performance for all of the hospitals. They're sorted in order of size so that the smallest hospitals are on the bottom and the biggest hospitals are at the top. And I've highlighted a couple of hospitals that have some sort of interesting patterns, which is Hospital A here up at the very top. It's the very largest measured in terms of pediatric admissions. And today's data, it comes in well below the expected performance. So that is, it's performing better than expected. So for Hospital A, we're not going to do anything at all. Hospitals B and D, which are a little bit harder to see, actually come in well above their safety performance targets. So these are the kinds of hospitals where we're going to go after that signal and figure out what to do. When we actually apply this decision-making framework to the hospitals in the data and compare my Bayesian proposal with this Z-score proposal, straw man, you see that along the diagonal, most of the hospitals have the same decision under each of the rules, which is reassuring. Then there are a few cases where there's a dramatically different. So the further off of the diagonal of this table you get, the more discrepant the decisions are under the two rules. And the places where this tends to happen are places where the hospital characteristics become very important in the Bayesian decision-making framework, but the Z-scores cannot see that. They can't see that it's a critical access hospital. They can't see that it's a small hospital with few resources to devote, things like that. The Z-scores just see the strength of the safety signal, and they don't see any of the other considerations. So those are the places where the decisions become very discrepant. And so here's an example of Hospital C is a case where under the Z-score rule, we end up with a very large loss to the system when we make decisions using Z-scores instead of this Bayesian proposal that incorporates all of the factors that are important in our decision making. So the strengths of this approach are that it incorporates some cool statistical machinery, which I think is very useful. It makes explicit the things that we care about in the form of the loss functions. We have to write down in numbers everything that is important to our decision. And it has this nice grounding in decision theory. The limitations are, of course, are that at least in the work I've shown you today, the modeling is very simplistic because we were working with very limited data, and the safety signal was very broad. I've asked you to insert your own favorite safety signal because I realize that this AMDE rate is not a great signal. So in the future, we're hoping to refine this by making the action space something that's more relevant to stakeholders, by incorporating loss functions that actually have input from stakeholders, and also by addressing the sequential decision problem, which we have so far set aside. So there's a paper out in Medical Decision Making, which you can read if you want all of the cool Greek letters and the simulation study. And otherwise, you can check out my Twitter or my website or email me if you have other questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. It's wonderful to see, well, actually not to see any Greek letters from a statistician. So thank you very much for those of us who are not so inclined. Question for you. Do you envision other settings where you could be, let's say, applying the same decision-making framework, your ability to sort of make explicit those things that are often left unsaid? Just maybe your thoughts on that one.
Thanks very much. Yeah, what I would actually like to do is apply this work in collaboration with a device manufacturer. In the case that I've outlined here, I actually imagine that there are sort of two sides of the table. That is the hospitals themselves and then a state hospital watchdogs for safety. In that case, it's very difficult to get both parties to agree on the appropriate metrics and on the loss function. But in the case of a medical device manufacturer, they're just one party. So you can get them to agree on all of the factors in the decision model, so all of the elements of the loss function, they could probably agree on that. And they also collect all their own data on the performance of their devices out in the real world. They keep a really good eye on that. And although that's all treated usually in a very proprietary way, at least you wouldn't have this antagonistic relationship between the decision maker and the target of the safety monitoring process. So I would really love to sit down with a manufacturer and get them to say to me, how much in dollars does it cost to have a public relations fiasco? How much in dollars does it cost to have a product recall? Things like that. And then what are the sources of data that you are continuously monitoring out in the real world for the performance of your devices?
Thank you again, Laura. So our third speaker for this morning's panel on medical devices is Patricia Trubovich from the University Health Network in Toronto. And we're just going to switch machines right now because Patricia's using a Mac and has some funky graphics embedded in here. I'm not to let there to be any dead air because it's a webinar, so I'll talk about the weather. We've already talked a little bit about hockey, but the weather, it was a little cold this morning here in Ottawa. Could see your breath, but I've been assured that it will get nicer this afternoon. And Patricia's all set? Okay, so I'll keep talking. What else? Go Sens Go. I'll be in New York City next week, actually, on the subject of medical devices. I probably should let people know about the work of the IDEAL collaboration. And I will tweet about that because I'm now getting the signal that we're all set to go. So thank you very much for indulging me. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity to present today. So today I'm going to be talking about how human factors engineering can be applied to the design and evaluation of medical devices. I always like to start off with this quote: medicine has become the act of managing extreme complexity and a test of whether such complexity can, in fact, be humanly mastered. I like it because I think it represents the current state of healthcare. We often introduce new technologies, workflow processes, procedures into healthcare environments, but we're not always doing so in a way that is conducive to clinicians' work. Despite the fact that we have examples of technologies that have revolutionized the way that we deliver care, we have many more examples of technologies that have actually increased the rate of preventable adverse events in our healthcare systems and increased the cost in healthcare. Here's a quote from a report in the business report that talks about the costly paradox of healthcare technology. And it highlights that in every industry but one, technology makes things better and cheaper. Why is it that innovation increases the cost in healthcare? And one of the things that they point out is that we often favor action over evidence. We think that just putting in any new technology is going to be better than the status quo. We don't necessarily do so in the same rigorous and thorough process that we would for a drug, for example. And so what we're left with is that there's often a low health value per dollar spent. We know that the impacts can be both economic and patient safety related. So we know that the most frequent reason for device recalls are related to how the software and hardware have been designed. We also know that medical error is the third leading cause of deaths in the U.S., and there's similar statistics for Canada and the UK, and that one of the main reasons for adverse events that are occurring is how our clinicians are interacting or our patients are interacting with medical devices. So what is human factors? It's the study of how people interact physically and psychologically with our products, tools, and processes. So what this definition is trying to get at is that what we do in human factors is not only design the technologies, but it's also about really having an understanding of who are our end users, what are their limitations, what are their cognitive biases, and ensuring that the design of our devices incorporates those limitations. The second definition there is working to make the environment function in a way that seems natural to people. So what we're trying to do is ensure that the right thing to do is the easy thing to do by how we've designed the device. This becomes particularly important because now we're sending patients home with their devices. So we have to take into consideration that our users are now patients and our environments are not only clinical units, but they're also patients' homes. And so it's really important that we ensure that, that we've designed accordingly. So today I want to highlight on three different ways that we interact with manufacturers or with researchers when it comes to randomized controlled trials, for example. One of the things that we first start with is helping in the hazard risk assessment. And then the two last ones are we're particularly involved, which are in the formative evaluations of the technology as well as the summative evaluations. So in terms of the hazard risk assessment, the focus here is to really understand whether the clinical benefits outweigh the clinical risk to the patient. And of course, manufacturers have a process that they go through. There's different regulations that they have to abide by. But as human factors specialists, we often help out with this through a technique called our heuristic evaluation. And basically, as human factors specialists, we'll look through the different medical devices and ensure that they're not violating basic principles of good design. So the hazard risk assessment answers the question, what are the potential risks or hazards that exist with the medical device? The next question is, how will we try to mitigate these hazards and risks? And so how we do this is through formative evaluation. Now, we use what we call usability testing, and usability testing is an evaluation of an intervention. And here I want to specify that an intervention could be a technology, but it could also be a checklist, it could be a training, it doesn't necessarily have to be equipment per se. by having representative end users, so I don't get my engineering colleagues to come and try out a prototype of a device, but we get, if it's nurses that are expected to use it, we'll have nurses come in, pharmacists, physicians, patients, and we have them perform representative tasks. In our formative evaluation phase, we're usually in a low fidelity usability testing setting, and what I mean by that is we're not trying to replicate the environment, but sometimes it could be something as simple as in an office setting such as this. So we'll have the person come through and they might interact with the software or the hardware that we put them to. And we ask them to follow a think aloud protocol. So it's basically give us a play-by-play of what's going on in your mind as you're interacting with the system. This gives us a sense of what is confusing to them, why is it confusing, and sometimes it can even be something as simple as the terminology that's been used. So it helps us understand what their mental model of the system is so that hopefully in the next design, the next iterative design that we do, that we can implement those feedback. So we document the performance, so it's not just their subjective performance that we're looking at, but we're objectively observing them as they're interacting, and we can see where they're making errors and where they're skipping steps and so forth. And then we usually record in video and audio everything so that we can go back to it after. For our formative testing, often 5 to 7 users per iteration is enough. And the reason for this is that we're not trying to get statistical significance. We're not trying to prove that one design is better than another. Rather, what we're trying to do is a quality improvement initiative here, where we're just trying to understand if 3 people are expressing that they're having difficulty with the same feature of a device, I don't need to test 20 more. I know that this is a problem. I might as well go back to the vendor or back to the designer and say, let's come up with a next iteration of this prototype and test it again. And so in the formative evaluation, we're going through this process iteratively and ideally before the product has made its way onto the market. So here I want to show a brief clip of a usability testing session, and what you're going to see here, this is a formative usability session, so it was a low fidelity environment with a prototype of a physician order entry system, and so you're going to hear 3 oncologists express their thoughts as they're interacting with this physician order entry system. You're going to notice that there's an area here where they have to decide between using the American or Medlog algorithm when calculating body surface area, which is an important calculation to decide how much chemotherapy a patient will receive. And so I'll play the clip here and you'll be able to hear.
The American versus Medlog thing isn't something I know anything about. I'm not clear about what does Medlog means. I mean, body surface area, there are 2 options, American, and then there's this thing, Medlog. I'm not clear what does this mean.
Yeah, so most physicians, myself included, do not look at the algorithm for calculating BSA. We simply accept what's there. And putting in these 2 things has some danger attached to it. And the danger is that people flip back and forth with these depending upon what they're used to and what patient they're treating. So my recommendation is to take that out entirely.
So you can see here that the vendors probably thought that this was a good thing to give the option of these 2 algorithms, but something as simple as having a few people come in and actually interact with it before it makes its way into the real environment helps us understand how a small change can have a big impact on safety. So the formative evaluation really answers the question, how did we try to mitigate the hazards and risks? And again, we go through this in an iterative process. And the next question is, can we prove that we've mitigated that hazard or risk? So in order to prove that we have, then we go through what is referred to as summative evaluation. So this includes objective performance-based evaluation of task success. So here we are going to have to increase the sample size because we do want to show statistically that it is better. We focus on high priority tasks and on tasks that are related to patient safety. We can't test everything on certain medical devices, but we'll really focus on the ones that could be related to safety. So when we're doing summative evaluations, we do go to the next level of fidelity in our simulation testing. So we use high fidelity simulation testing, which basically means that we're trying to recreate as best we can the environment in which these are going to be used. So we do so either in a lab environment or sometimes even in situ, so in the actual clinical environment. So here you can see different examples of setups that we've had in our labs, from anything from an operating room, patient ward, a home, or even a helicopter. This was for a device that was used by paramedics in the for U.S. aviation, and they had to use it in a helicopter. So the reason we want high fidelity is that it's one thing to be interacting with these devices when the lighting is good and the noise level is good, but yet another when you're interrupted or you're distracted or you're having to wear gloves. So we need to test it within these real contextual environments to be able to get at some of the usability issues. So when I was saying that with formative testing, 5 to 7 users is usually enough. When we go to the summative testing, we usually need at least 15 to 20, sometimes many more, depending on the extent of the evaluation, so that we can make more performance-based assessments. So the summative testing answers the question, have you mitigated the hazards and risks? And what we find, though, is that usually what manufacturers will do will focus on the hazards assessment and the summative evaluation. And they often will skip this middle section of doing the iterative formative evaluations of the product. And so what ends up happening in what we often refer to as the valley of death. So this is where good ideas, good products go to die, not because they weren't good ideas, but oftentimes because just a few iterations of formative usability testing would have helped them understand how they could make their product ready for the marketplace. So I'm going to end with a clip. It's a small video with a series of clips of usability testing in the formative stage that we've conducted in our labs to hopefully convince you of the fact that this type of testing is really important, again, especially before it makes its way into the marketplace. So we're really often trying to do this pre-market.
Does that automatically delete everything I just programmed in?
This is the most complicated thing I've ever seen.
This machine is a backbreaker. I just noticed. We need a chair just to program these things.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. Oh, that's crazy.
So, I'm so confused. Way too confusing. It's killing me.
I don't know what's going on.
Oh, schnocks. Why isn't this opening?
Unbelievable. 50 items there, and I've got to choose you in volume, and I don't know where it is. I have no idea.
Okay, this is not front. Oh, you have to put them on the front and back?
Oh, for God's sake. That's why we need to get rid of them. See? This is bullshit. Sorry. I find this is not user friendly at all.
I just wish I could edit here. I don't understand why this is so complicated.
I'm feeling so stupid.
That's dangerous.
So, this is where we really try to get involved in the pre-market space. I hope you can see that, by having users tell you and observe them as they're interacting with these devices, it's really helpful in understanding how oftentimes simple tweaks can make a big difference. In the same way, we work with researchers as well to ensure that this kind of testing happens before they go to a full randomized control trial. So thank you again, and if anyone is interested in more information, my group has put together a book that's freely available from the IFMB website. Thank you again.
So, Patricia, question for you while you're switching back to the other computer. You mentioned working in that sort of very early space, the product development space. I'm wondering if hospitals actually use this approach when they're acquiring the technology in terms of figuring out how it's going to work in the real world. So are you guys busy in that space?
Yes, well, actually, it's actually the way our team had started at the hospital, at the University Health Network, is that we were involved in the procurement process. So now, instead of it being, mostly focused on the different specifications or the cost of the device, usability testing is a central part for devices of certain classes. And we will have clinicians come and interact with, if we've shortlisted it down to 3 different vendors, then we'll have them come and perform tasks. And it really has influenced the purchasing decision. Not only does it influence the decision, but it also helps clinicians with the buy-in. So if they've seen that they've had a say in the device that they're going to be expected to use, then the buy-in later is much easier. Also, it helps us understand where training needs to be focused as well when we introduce these systems. And there have been times when, because of the usability testing, we found that none of the 3 shortlisted vendors met the necessary requirements, and so we've decided not to go forward with the purchase at all. We know that we're stuck with these technologies. They're expensive, and we're stuck with them for many years, so doing this type of testing, which is not very expensive, can go a long way.
So last but not least, I'm pleased to be able to welcome Mark Campbell from NICE to our panel today. Mark's let us know that because of the election that's been called in the UK, there might be some things that he's no longer able to say, but perhaps you can follow him out of the room because we'll be heading straight to lunch after this session. With that being said, let me just bring Mark's presentation up here on. To you.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for having to sort of preface the session by such an administrative remark that already sounds very British. But if there are people from British Columbia, anybody here from BC? So you're in the same position. You're in the pre-election. So thanks to Tammy and the organisers for asking me to be part of this session. It's really great to hear these 3 sort of methodological presentations. And I guess what I'm going to try to let you have is a bit of a reflection of the past 5 or 6 years where we've been running evaluation programs for devices, diagnostics, digital technologies. But just before I get into that, so it's very easy to become kind of quite arrogant and assume that people are completely up to speed with what NICE does in the UK. So I kind of have an obligatory slide to say this is our current DNA. It's a little different from where we started. So we started in the top bubble 17 or 18 years ago, and we've kind of expanded into an organisation that's trying to do, as I think Carotid is trying to do. You were talking about health technology implementation and management earlier, a kind of value-added HTA organisation, just trying to reflect the evolving needs of health and care systems. Anyway, enough of the wider perspective. So about, 5, 6, 7 years ago now, we introduced 2 completely new programs at NICE, which is quite a big deal at the time, still feels quite a big deal, to cover medical devices and diagnostic technologies, the full spectrum of those. And we did that because we had actually not a lot of capacity at the time to handle non-drug technologies. And maybe as, if not more important, we didn't have a lot of bespoke methods. So you've heard 3 excellent presentations outlining why it's jolly difficult to evaluate some of these non-drug technologies. So we needed to devise some fairly sort of bespoke methods. And we also had very little connection with the industry sector. We had 10 years of working with big pharmaceutical companies, but completely different, these sort of thousands and thousands and thousands of innovators beavering away in their garden sheds, trying to invent the next big thing. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we've tried to develop our expertise in observational data as we go through. And so we took some fairly radical approaches to the methods for these programs. So first of all, we said, do you know what? We need to be quite permissive about the data. And these statements, this is quite an old slide, these made people gasp. They said, what? NICE is not going to require a randomized controlled trial as part of the evidence base. But if you do that for devices and diagnostics, you kind of hit a blue screen in many cases. And then the other thing we kind of fairly quickly caught on to is that much of medtech comes to market claiming to be cost-saving, and it doesn't have the evidence to do conventional cost-effectiveness analysis. So we introduced a new economic method, which I don't think had been used much at NICE before that, this cost consequences analysis, where you're just assuming clinical non-inferiority and you're figuring out what the cost per patient saving might be. And the relevance of all of that to this session is that much of what we've used, as you'll see, has been comprised of what you might call kind of real-world observational data, whatever that is, and kind of yet to be defined. I think we know what we think. We know what individual data sets are, but it's quite a wide, quite a broad church. So this is the way this kind of programs currently work. Is we have quite a permissive approach to what comes into that hopper at the top, a wide range of technologies. Many of those are brought to us by manufacturers, and we have a kind of very active company engagement function. And what we're trying to do is kind of land these technologies in the right kind of environment, which is not going to expose them to harm. It's going to try and nurture them, turn away the ones that no one can see any value in. And on the left, you'll see that we've got some activities which are around positively engaging with companies a bit more upstream. Some of that's around paid-for services. And then towards the right-hand side, we've got a range of kind of evaluation and assessment options that's trying to be reasonably tailored and use the kind of evidence that these products come to us with and the sort of degree of maturity that they come to us displaying. And then because NICE's output is reasonably sort of voluminous now, most of our output now is populated into a standard pathway where you can find stuff easily. That's a sort of flag of convenience for our sort of user base. And just before I leave this slide, so in the advice column, again working along the similar lines to the sort of moving from HTA to HTM, we do a fair amount of work trying to identify barriers to adoption for technologies that we might well recommend. So that's quite new work. It's quite tricky, trying to reflect back real-world experience of people trying to get a handle on how do you introduce things that might be quite disruptive into care pathways. So there's a whole spread of activities that we're trying to play technologies into. So these are the outputs. I'll kind of, you can kind of go back to the slide, but basically there's a kind of spectrum. There's almost a product journey going from top to bottom here, which is about new and novel procedures. 2/3 of those involve a device or some other sort of implant. And moving through a sort of degree of maturity such that you might take a quick look at something, summarize the evidence, try and point up its place in therapy. Then it might be have a sufficiently mature evidence base to be able to make some recommendations for system-wide adoption. And then eventually, a few of these new technologies may make their way into sort of standard care guidelines where they're expected to be the standard of care for most patients with that condition at that stage of their condition. So we're kind of trying to sort of tailor and the extent and the sort of breadth and depth of observational data that things come along with at various stages varies. And quite quickly we realized that we needed to get some proper kind of experience and expertise with this. And so about kind of, halfway through our journey from 2010 to now, we developed quite a small unit, but quite an active unit, to take a proper look at issues to do with observational data. And we've done quite a lot of work before that, particularly around the interventional procedures and the creation, modification of patient registers, using those to update our guidance. But there was kind of a trigger point when NHS England, which is the national payer organisation, wanted us to do some work for them to take a look at some procedures and some products that were promising, but they weren't ready for routine commissioning without some sort of prospective data collection. So that was kind of the trigger, although we've been thinking about it for a while, trying to consolidate our experience and expertise in observational data. But that scheme called commissioning through evaluation was kind of the trigger to kind of establish a unit and a sort of advisory group. Oopsie-daisy. So these are for procedures or technologies that are not routinely commissioned, but they're promising. And so much in the same way as you've heard from other speakers, you kind of get some uptake going and you follow it, you try and collect the data, you try and do data linkage. It's actually quite fraught. This is not easy work, but it's led to, I guess, a wealth of experience for us in trying to understand some of the difficulties. If you blithely say, oh, we will make a recommendation for, coverage with evidence development or whichever sort of taxonomy you want, it's really hard work, actually. And for people who say that observational data is the future, well, if it is the future, it's a really resource-intensive future, notwithstanding the kind of methodological issues that you've had my previous panelists talk about. These are the types of procedures, and I'm going to talk about them individually, but you can see the types of things that the National Commissioner wanted to introduce, but there was really poor quality data, both in quantity and in sort of quality. So those are the kind of procedures that we're doing this type of observational data collection and analysis work on. And so finally, I just wanted just kind of quick reflection, I guess, on where the extent and the purposes to which we've put the observational data of all kinds. So I'm talking about audit data, case series, cohort studies, case control studies, all of that sort of non-comparative stuff. We've kind of assimilated for most of the technologies that we've covered over the last 6 or 7 years. So I think we've now handled, in terms of products, in terms of devices, diagnostics, digital products, probably about 350 products, and about twice that in terms of the number of procedures, surgical procedures that we've taken a look at. So kind of going from left to right, we're going from sort of simple advice products to guidance products where we make recommendations for system-wide adoption. So for the advice product, that's a sort of early signal. We're just saying it looks interesting. We don't make any recommendations. We almost always have some sort of observational data to assess and summarize in those products. In terms of looking at procedures, that would be pretty frequent and pretty often when it comes to guidance involving individual device or diagnostic products. And then in the next line along, we're thinking about the extent to which observational data is relied on for decision making. And here we're thinking about decision making by our independent advisory committees. So the NICE operating model is that NICE acts as a sort of technical secretariat, but the decision makers who develop our recommendations are independent advisory committees, and they will be using routinely observational data in making those recommendations. And then finally, on the kind of bottom row, that's thinking about the extent to which we're using observational data to prompt further evidence, or we're recommending that clinicians, researchers, companies, academics go away and try and develop some evidence where we think there's some promise and some value, but there are sort of crucial gaps in the evidence. And that's been a really active area. So in the interventional procedures program, second in, we have recommended and played an active hand in the development or creation of about 30 patient registries. Some of those have fed multiple items of guidance, and we've used data from those in about a half of cases where we're updating guidance. That's where we couldn't come to a conclusive recommendation first time around. Recommend some registry development, take the data back to take another look at it, update the guidance, and actually, in many cases, that enables you to issue a normal sort of recommendation for use where you couldn't before. In the guidance programs dealing with products, the two rightmost columns, we have some capability to stay with those products where we make research recommendations, and in some cases those will result in the facilitation of observational data. Again, the hope is that if we can do that, we can bring that up new data back in order to update the original recommendation. So I think that's actually me, short in time. Is that good? So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
So Mark, I do want to ask a question of you because I've been on the receiving end of this question many times. How do you respond to people who might suggest that we're dumbing down our evidence by accepting observational studies instead of requiring that good old RCT? So over to you, and I'm leaving the stage.
Thank you, Tammy. It's a really good question. We hear it all the time. People sometimes throw things at us even. They're prompted to. So there's two answers. So one is that in the crazy, flaky world of medtech, the burden of proof is highly dependent on the claims that are made for products. So simple claims require simple evidence. So if you're operating on technologies that are away from high risk implantable sort of devices, and you're at the sort of simpler end of the technology, and you can kind of see what the thing's designed to do, your evidence requirement might actually be a bit less. So in those cases, you might actually be quite happy with some high quality observational data. The other answer, the kind of more serious answer, I guess, is that is the reason why we set up the Observational Data Unit, which is actually to enable us to have the same kind of robust methods for assessing the quality of observational data that we have been used to having for randomized controlled trials and economic evaluation. And again, the three presentations that preceded me are really good examples of, because we probably don't yet have systematic methods for example, assessing bias in observational studies. So at NICE, we rely heavily on the judgment of our independent advisory committees, supported by the best expert advice we can find, both clinical, patient, scientific, methodological advice that we can find, to kind of trade off, if you like, what you might otherwise see as lower quality data, to be able to make decisions that are kind of as rigorously and robustly developed as decisions based on conventional comparative data.
So we do have a few minutes before lunch starts, so I'll invite our other panelists to come up front, and I'm going to encourage people in the audience or online to pose questions to the crowd. Looking around, I do have one question while people are getting seated, is about the extent of international engagement or collaboration. So each of you spoke about particular activities that are going on with your group or with your agency, and I'm just wondering how interconnected you are to perhaps other international activities. Patricia, in particular, you mentioned the Medical and Biomedical Engineers Federation, I think.
Yes.
So maybe I'll start with you if you want to maybe talk about your engagement with that particular group.
Okay, sure. So so there is IFMB. That's one organization that it's fairly new. Human Factors is still fairly new to that group, but they've been really great at embracing us. And through that, we have a lot of collaborations with other countries, including Brazil and Spain, where we've been helping them develop laboratories, either in their universities and sometimes even in hospitals. So Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more international collaboration. Also, obviously, with the U.S. because the FDA has actually mandated that usability testing be part of evaluations of certain classes of devices. And Health Canada, although it's not a formal regulation, it is highly recommended.
Mark, I saw you raise your hand.
I'll just mention one thing, if I might. So the sort of the UNETA network, one of the projects I'm excited about, system for a great age. You work on this so that you some assurance.
Great. We do have a question from the crowd, and so if you want to speak really loudly, and if, oh, we do have a microphone. Perfect. Wonderful. Just again for folks who are participating via webinar.
My name is Mohsen. I'm from. I have a very interesting concept. I want to see if it can be brought out of its, the application that you had in the paper. Does it have to be a medical device? Do you have to look at like multiple adverse effects? I am looking at ways of identifying like hospitals that have too many readmissions rates for COPD, for example. Can this be used against the traditional metrics of let's just rank hospitals based on the...
Absolutely. You could insert any safety or efficacy on, it can be at the hospital level, it could be at the provider level. I'm also in provider, facility, it could be device level. You could compare actions that you take not be safety actions. They could be payer type actions. This could be rewarding or penal organization side. So the framework is adaptable to outcomes that are of interest to you and the action space.
Or lower readmissions rates, acceptable cost, like higher threshold until it's doable using this.
Absolutely, and the work that I presented was focused, so the loss functions focused on analyzing poor performers, but you can absolutely have asymmetric loss functions. Is that recognize that good performance supported or poor performance boundary, absolutely flexible.
Great, and I do have one question that's been submitted online. This one might be the last one before we head to lunch. So I think we're all aware of polypharmacy, and so this is when patients are on multiple medications. I think it's safe to say that we could have patients out there who are poly-device. So what we've heard today is, very much a focus on a single technology, single intervention, a registry based on a certain device. Are there other examples that incorporate sort of a multiple device setting, or could we envision a future where that might be, the end goal? So examining people perhaps who have, multiple implanted. So I don't know who wants to tackle that one first.
Human factors.
Yeah. Well, I don't know of a really good one where multiple implanted devices, but one of the areas that we're often working with multiple devices. So I'm thinking of a project that we're doing right now in pediatric hospital ICU, where one of the challenges is that the clinicians have to rely on disparate technologies and they have to make the decisions. They have to assimilate that information and make those decisions in their head, really. And so now there's new devices that are trying to consolidate some of that, show it to them in a way that helps them make those decisions. But unfortunately, we're not there yet, because what we're finding is that although it's theoretically a good idea, it's really difficult to display all those different pieces of data and transform it into information in a way that really is compelling.
I do have one last question that's come in under the wire, and this one's directed at you, Mark. And it's, to what extent does NICE have an appetite for adaptive or pragmatic trial designs to generate evidence for medical devices?
Really good question. So we've been heavily involved in sort of corresponding initiatives for pharmaceuticals through the Early Access to Medicine scheme, jointly with the regulators in Europe. And I guess there's a sort of flippant answer, which is medical devices already have adaptive license. So they get licensed very quickly for something, and then they kind of, certainly as far as CE marking is concerned, sort of go through this iterative thing. But it might be a slightly different question, which is, at the stage where something is first licensed, in terms of health and care system value, you might have considerable evidence of promise, but you might not have much evidence of value. So that might be the journey that products go on. And it may not be a sort of regulatory sort of iteration, just evidence journey. And, we were talking in the plenary session earlier, again, back to this theme of sort of management of introduction of innovation. That's certainly something people are really interested in, picking up products early and seeing if on a sort of lit runway, if you like, to some sort of maturity.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our 4 panelists for a wonderful discussion. And thank you to those of you who joined us virtually. I guess it is now lunchtime, and so that will be upstairs. Our next sessions